The last panel looked at the client journey and some of the obstacles and some of the opportunities, but also some experiences from the panelists and how they've experienced that and what they are doing as service providers, and the ethnographic research as well. It gives us insights into that. This next panel is not going to look to the past, but is going to look to the future. So this panel is going to ask you to imagine an ecosystem, an entire ecosystem, which is dedicated to client innovation and focus on clients. Is that even possible? An entire ecosystem that's dedicated to this innovation and client centricity. Is it possible, or is it science fiction? The answer to that will come with the panel, which has been put together by my colleague, Olga Morawczynski from the Mastercard Foundation, a program manager, and I'd like her to come out now and to introduce her panel as well. So please welcome them to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As Roger mentioned, this is a panel about the future, so we're going to look into about 2030. So the bad news is we're all 12 years older. The good news is we still look good. And as Roger said, we have an entire ecosystem that's geared towards client centricity. So I'll show you what that could possibly look like. Over the next hour and a bit, we're going to do two things. The first is we'll look at some of the broader technology and business model trends that are really shaping the world around us today. More specifically, we'll examine the rise of something we're going to call the super platform, which is a powerful force shaping the evolution of digital ecosystems. Secondly, we'll hypothesize a future. And again, our frame for the future is 2030, in which super platforms become entrenched in Africa and begin to affect change in markets that we work and perhaps even sit in today, for financial service providers, but also for our clients. I've enrolled a very handsome but also distinguished panel that are going to help us make sense of these trends, but also some of their implications. And I'll also be looking to all of you for feedback, and you will be asked to react to a set of provocations that are linked to the story that I'm about to tell, and you can also tell me just how convincing I am. So before we start to make the case about the rise and disruption of these super platforms, we need to set some parameters, thank you, around what these super platforms are and explain how they're growing. So please give me about 10 to 15 minutes to do just that before I turn it over to the panel. The first distinguishing feature of super platforms are their sheer size. So if we look at the world's largest companies today, and this is essentially by market capitalization, over half, the ones that are in yellow, fall under the category of super platforms as we will define it here. The fact that these super platforms dominate this list is new. If we were to look 12 years back, since we're looking 12 years forward, only one of the companies, and that's Microsoft, was on this list. Apple and Amazon were struggling. Google had just been listed, and Facebook barely existed. So I just want to say that the rise of these companies is really, really a new phenomenon. But apart from their sheer size, there's other important distinguishing characteristics too. These super platforms not only leverage technology, but they're born digital. They're platform-based business models, meaning that they derive value from creating ecosystems. Ecosystems that make possible exchange and two-way exchange, either of physical assets, as we saw with Jumia this morning, or in the case of Alibaba, and digital ones, as we see with Facebook or Alphabet, which is, of course, the parent company for Google. But what graduates these companies from just being platforms to being super ones is just how they grow. From the onset, these companies are set up for a type of growth that is fast, that is focused, and that is fierce. And super platforms will enroll the actors and resources that add value to their ecosystem as a whole, irrespective of superficial boundaries like business line, like industry, and even geography. And as a result, as we'll show you, they not only transcend, but they disrupt each and every one of these boundaries. Now, because these companies are born digital, they're able to amass a significant amount of data on customers, which they exploit with remarkable effectiveness to fuel their own growth. And by doing so, they put pressure on incumbents across a number of industries, including financial services, to digitize, and they will fiercely eat into the margins of those competitors that are slow to respond. Okay, so to really start to bring this to life a little bit, we wanted to get under the hood of one of the super platforms that was on the list, and that's Alibaba. Now, this is a company that's already entered the sphere of financial services, and it is rocking markets in China today. We also predict, as you'll see here, that it might start to affect some change in Africa. So Alibaba is 18 years young. It was started by a school teacher, some of you might have heard of Jack Ma, who saw a real opportunity to link Chinese sellers who had excess stock from the country's manufacturing boom to a global marketplace via e-commerce. But it didn't take long for Alibaba to expand their e-commerce offering to appeal to buyers and sellers in different market niches, both domestically but also abroad. It also didn't take long for the company to enter sectors beyond e-commerce, which is why this all looks so complicated up there. From data, to logistics, to ride-hailing, and the list goes on, causing disruption throughout. But it was their entry into financial services that really warrants our attention. When the company launched their digital wallet, Alipay, it was not with the intention really to enter or disrupt financial markets or financial services, but rather to reinforce trust between the buyers and the sellers on their platform. And that's by keeping funds in an escrow account until the sale was verified by the buyer. This allowed Alibaba to move beyond cash on delivery and fueled the growth of their entire ecosystem. And you heard Juliet this morning saying that these guys are still doing cash on delivery, and that does cause a few challenges. So Alipay was eventually spun out as a separate company, which you might have also heard of, called Ant Financial, and more financial services began to be layered onto the digital wallet. Today, the company has over 520 million users in China and has become really the de facto payment mechanism for an increasingly digital China. Just to say, this reinforcing strategy of growth has worked really well for Alibaba. When the company went public in 2014, it managed to raise $25 billion in the biggest IPO the world has ever seen, and it continues to grow fiercely at 50 to 60% every year on revenue. The company's plans for the future are even more ambitious. Jack Ma is looking global, and he's made that clear many times, and he wants Alibaba to become the world's 5th largest economy, not company, economy, by 2036, amassing a customer base of 2 billion and creating 100 million new jobs. So just to give you a sense, I looked this up on who's going to be the largest economies by 2030. It's going to be China, US, India, Japan, and if Jack Ma has his way, Alibaba. So just to make this plan real, Alibaba has recently invested $15 billion in building out a global logistics network, and the same amount to testing cutting-edge technologies, such as drones, because we know Anne loves drones, that can help move goods to even the remotest part of the world. You might know where we're going with this story, but given this insatiable need for growth, we have several reasons to believe that expansion into Africa could make sense and could be next. So, by the way, these are revenue bubbles, not presence bubbles. But most of the global market is already saturated, and today's super platforms are unlikely and probably even unable to assault each other's home markets. So we probably won't see Amazon, Facebook, or Google penetrate China, although we know they've tried. And it's probably unlikely for Alibaba to seriously challenge Amazon in North America or in Europe. So we recognize that not all countries in Africa are equally ripe for growth, but there are some, like Nigeria, that could be suitable candidates. By 2030, the country will have seen an expansion of reliable and affordable data connectivity and smartphone penetration close to 70%, with a projected population of over 260 million by 2030 and a rising middle class. Nigeria could be a lucrative battleground for the world's hungriest super platforms. And although it's true, and we heard today, I mean, there's still some challenges with logistics networks. Only 20% of Nigerians, just to give you a sense, can receive their mail at home today. We believe that by 2030, the innovations that are currently being tested in the labs of super platforms, such as drones, coupled with innovations around global addressing systems, which Juliet also mentioned this morning, will make possible what seems like science fiction today. And that's the ability to easily move goods to even to some of the most remote parts of this region. And we believe if these super platforms were to enter Nigeria, it'd be disruptive for clients. Super platforms will offer a type of supercharged client centricity. The more these platforms grow, the more data they accumulate across product lines, the better they become at tailoring their products and services to the customer journeys that might require financial decisions. Alibaba is already offering microloans to merchants based on sales activity on their e-commerce platform. Super platforms also embed financial services into a much broader repertoire of products almost seamlessly. And as the super platform grows, they layer on use cases to the nth degree for financial services, constantly stimulating usage. We also have no doubt that these super platforms can be disruptive, especially for providers of financial services. We're already seeing disruption in China, and banks are seeing massive erosions in their margins. And experts are warning that if these banks don't digitize, they risk becoming redundant. What might give these super platforms a significant advantage, especially if they do enter the financial services sphere here in Africa, is their ability to cross-subsidize their product lines. We all know that offering particular types of financial services, especially to low-income clients, can be tough business. And I think we've learned from projects like GAFIS, products like low balance savings account only have a business case when offered alongside more lucrative lines of business. The super platforms that enter this space see finance as a means to a much bigger end. And even if not profitable as a standalone, financial services are still considered critical as long as they can add value to the ecosystem as the whole, which they do. And because super platforms are able to make a loss, even in the long term, they are well positioned to disrupt a market where margins are already tight. Okay, so based on the story that we just told, we wanted to test some early hypotheses with you on the rise and impact of super platforms, which we'll then hand over to our panel to comment on. You all know how to use your clickers already, so thank you, Roger, for that tutorial. So you just saved me a couple of minutes. But let me take you through these. And I'm still going to make a little bit of a case before voting is opened. So the first one, super platforms will be the most powerful force shaping digital ecosystems over the next 10 to 12 years. And they are coming to Africa soon. So I just wanted to say, before I open voting, what we're exploring here is not just the rise of super platforms and how it's actually how the shift to digital will play out in these markets, and more importantly, who will lead that shift. And we focused on the entry of a Chinese player, but note that some of these super platforms are already here. They just haven't entered the space of finance, not in some of the markets that we work. So just to test that, can you put your hands up if you're either on WhatsApp or Facebook? Okay, Can you put your hands up if you've used it in the last 30 minutes? Can you put your hands up if you're on it right now? Okay. So just to say very quickly, Chris will speak to this a little bit later, but we just did a panel survey with a cold measure, and we saw that 98% of people in Kenya, this was across the country, actually have one of these apps on their phones. So these super platforms are here. And they're also entering the space of financial services. So some of you might have heard that Facebook launched P2P payments in the UK, in the US, and Philippines, and WhatsApp in India, reaching 200 million users. Are you convinced that super platforms, more than any other force, will affect how digitization happens and how digital ecosystems evolve by 2030? Okay, I'm gonna open voting. You have 3 options. 1, you agree, it's already happening. 2, you disagree, there is no way. 3, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Shall we see the results?
Ooh.
All right. This is good. I am convincing. Told you guys. Okay. So for the panelists, we'll put this back on, but there's already a sense that there's something bigger happening here that we do need to understand a bit better. Okay. Can we move on to the second provocation? Providers of financial services in this new world are at a high risk of becoming redundant. Now, the question that I want you to think about as you answer this, will banks in Africa be able to compete with some of the fastest growing companies in the world? Companies that can make losses on financial services, even in the longer term, and companies that hold so much data on customers. Let me open voting and see what you guys think. All right, should we see what we have here? Okay. There's a lot of bankers in the room. You know that, so I can imagine where you sit. But this is a little bit more split than the first one. So we know they're coming, but we still need to better understand how respective roles of providers will shift in markets. Super platforms will force us to rethink the paradigm of financial inclusion because financial services will inevitably fade into the background. So we are the Symposium for Financial Inclusion. I really want to revisit the problem that we're collectively trying to solve in this world, which is very quickly changing. Although the digital wallet, as we've seen, is a critical entry point into the world of super platforms, financial services are not the core value proposition here. In fact, the more that these platforms grow, the more finance becomes integrated into a much broader offering, and the more it fades into the background. We're not saying by any means that super platforms can or will solve the financial inclusion problem, but we are suggesting that they will force us, if they have not already, to revisit our paradigm for financial inclusion and redefine the problem that we're trying to solve. Do you agree? Let's open voting. Shall we see what we have? Okay. So more than half of the room thinks we should rethink all of this, which is interesting. Okay, great. So I will have our panel weigh in and move over to a more comfortable seat. Great, Professor Bade, let me start with you. You're a former banker and currently run the Chinese Academy of Financial Inclusion. You know the story of Alibaba and other rising Chinese fintechs very well, and obviously there's much more to the Chinese story than just Alibaba. And you recently wrote a book, or numerous books on the subject. Can you tell us more about the market factors that supported the rapid growth of these fintechs in China?
Yeah, I think several factors really drive this momentum. Number one is market demand. Since China is a huge country with a huge population, so the existing banking system just cover a part of population. So a lot of people are unbanked or underbanked. For example, let's say it's a MSME, it's a micro, small, medium enterprise. they create 90% of jobs of the country. However, if you look at the overall loan size of the banking system, only 20% of loan distributed to this MSME. So the financial structure is very much imbalanced. So this is a kind of, anyone disruptor like to provide financial products so they can easily access to this market. It's a huge demand over there. And number two, for this financial service provider, particularly for this fintech company, they use financial innovation. They provide technology-enabled products to their customers. So the supply is it's very well equipped by technology. So it's very much different from the old banking system. Some other factors also drive this process. I think which is very important in infrastructure in China. So the government spend a lot of money on building up all those telecom system, telecom network, 3G, 4G everywhere, even in the rural areas. Transportation system, distribution system are very well developed during the past 40 years. So all those digital financial services can be built up on this infrastructure. And one more thing I'd like to address is regulators' attitude toward these new things, financial innovations. At the beginning of this company emerging in the market, the government took a very tolerant attitude, very active to see what will be. And particularly for the top leader, all those top leaders are very powerful in China. They can make decisions. So they ask all those regulators. In China, there are 3 regulators. One is the banking regulator, securities industry regulator, and the insurance regulator. And the top leader just asks them, wait until something happens, okay? So there is clearly a tolerant period. So let all those new companies booming very fast, about 3 or 5 years. So this is also, I think, is a very important factor to drive this market booming.
Thank you. Chris, you are the founder of Caribou Digital, a research agency that builds out ethical and sustainable digital economies, which sounds very easy. But you're also one of our learning partners of the foundation under the Finance in a Digital Africa partnership. We just launched the website if anybody's interested in having a look. You've looked closely at the business model of the US super platforms like Facebook that, as we saw, are already here. Do you think that they're better positioned to disrupt African markets than the Chinese ones?
It's an interesting question. So the stat you gave earlier on that 98% of phones have a Facebook product on them, whether it's Facebook, WhatsApp, or Instagram, is driven from our company, Caribou Digital Data's tool Measure. We have an app that sits on smartphones and feature phones on demographically representative panels in countries. And it gives us incredible insight into what people are doing on their phones. And from that, we see that absolutely those products are already there. And actually, in Kenya and Nigeria, it can be up to 40% of all of the time someone is interacting with their phone is on a Facebook product, more likely WhatsApp. And even more alarmingly for financial services providers, we can see what apps people are using just before and just after a mobile money transaction. So in Kenya, the app most used 30 seconds before an M-Pesa transaction is WhatsApp, and the app most used 30 seconds after a transaction is WhatsApp. So they have the attention, and I think this is a really, really important distinction. We see in all of our data that absolutely for most people in sub-Saharan Africa, the internet is Facebook or WhatsApp, and that absolutely they have captured the attention of the users. What's interesting is we don't necessarily believe that they've captured the revenue. We did another piece of research with the Mozilla Foundation on digital advertising in emerging markets. And we show that digital advertising is, as a general pot of revenue, is very tightly linked to GDP. And even though all of Facebook's growth in subscribers has come from India, Southeast Asia, and Africa, their revenue growth is not. Their revenue growth is still very largely in the US and Europe. And they're going to find it hard to drive digital advertising revenue and to turn that massive amount of attention that they own into a sustainable revenue stream to keep those subscribers as you know, margin positive revenue subscribers. So given the fact that they're going to struggle, we think, with digital advertising because the size of the revenue just isn't there for them, we think this is going to push them inexorably towards financial services as an alternative revenue source. And again, if they are at the moment sitting both sides of those mobile money transactions, where people are rather reluctantly leaving WhatsApp to make a financial transaction, a P2P transaction, and then jumping back in again, you would expect that when they start to get quite serious about these, as Google Tez is in India, as WhatsApp is in India, that there is the potential there for them to take that revenue as well. But it's a structural change for them, moving from a business that's 98% digital advertising revenue to one that is a serious fintech player, is bigger costs, bigger margins, gets them exposed to regulation and a whole host of things that those Silicon Valley businesses tend to be relatively allergic to. So it will be an interesting battle between a lot of the Chinese companies that we've just spoken about, where their revenue streams tend to be more transactional and they have a better experience of driving revenues from low-income users, to the Silicon Valley companies who have absolutely captured the attention, but may structurally be incapable of turning that into sustainable revenue streams.
Great. I'll ask you later about how some of these bigger players might enter these markets, but that was interesting. I'm hoping not all of you are spending 40% of your time in this session on your phones watching.
Yeah.
Amolo, you've been in the financial inclusion space for a while, and through your advisory role currently at Bankable Frontiers, associates have worked with a wide array of players in the region, from banks, fintechs, donors. You really have a nice view of what's going on here. Your tenure in the industry has allowed you to see hype emerge, and let me tell you, we love hype in this industry around certain things, and also dissipate around a number of topics. What's your take on all of this whole super platform story? Is this something that really warrants our attention and maybe investment?
So I think, as we all saw when we all put up our hand, the super platform is already here. And let's show of hands of people who use Jumia. Okay, there's actually fewer than I expected, but I think the African super platforms are starting to emerge. So this time probably, the hype is real, but the challenge is to distinguish what's noise and what's signal, because there's a lot of, worry about super platforms coming in and just getting rid of the traditional financial sector. Seems to me unlikely because of the regulation that Professor Bay mentioned, the local cultural knowledge that the local institutions have. But at the same time, I think it's a true challenge to the business model, the customer relationship, and it's a gateway to the opportunity. You have all these people already on Facebook, on WhatsApp, and potentially on those new platforms. And you want to be the person connecting those two WhatsApp sessions rather than waiting for somebody else, including Facebook themselves, to do it. So I think it's a huge opportunity. I think this time that the hype is real, and if we come back in 2030, most people are going to be getting almost all of their services through one of those platforms. But whether those platforms are the provider or not, and who's actually going to win in this game, I think that's the part we have to distinguish.
So you're saying there could be a channel for our banks?
Might be, yes.
Great. And finally, Nadeem, through Anthemis, you have a pretty diversified portfolio of what you call digitally native companies. You told me they weren't fintechs, so you can speak more to that. But in Africa and globally, you also have an advisory arm that helps banks better position themselves in this big shift to digital. In case anyone of you is interested, you know who to call. What is different about this emerging class of fintechs playing in the financial services space? And do you think these global players are in a good position to really start to disrupt markets here in Africa?
Thank you so much. When we started Anthemis about 8 years ago, there was no such thing called fintech. It was called financial services. And we thought there was a big disruption coming, and we said, how do we get involved and think about this broadly? For us, it was really a vision of trying to redefine the world through the lens of financial services. And for us, it was a movement, right? So that gives you a little bit of background of why, when we started investing in startups, which were not categories at the time, so our first investment went into a company called Climate Corp, which launched the whole unbundling of insurance companies idea. Investment in Betterment was before there was such thing called robo-advisory, Simple before there was something called neobanking. And so there was a really a push to say, what are the disruptive models out there? How do you work with large financial institutions to kind of really help them understand the space? And but really, as importantly, there was a case for how do you think about the policy, infrastructure, regulatory environments around financial services, because all those things have to come together. So it wasn't a case of someone creates a startup, 5,000 people, and suddenly we're going to change the world. Really change the world in financial services, we have to think about all those dimensions. That's what we try to do at Anthemis. I think there is a couple of areas from a thesis point of view and think about where we are, what's happening out there, how do we evaluate business models. So there's clearly disruption going on in business models. And when we think about fintech, a lot of people tend to think about payments, lending, and quite narrow definition of fintech. Fintech is everything financial services, right? We think about retail banking, we're taking out capital markets, wealth management, asset management, payments. Notice one of the categories, kind of thinking about blockchain infrastructure, insurance. These are all really a part of what we think about financial services and now think about as fintech businesses. There's a big disruption going on around the organization model, which is around thinking about the unbundling of the vertical hierarchy of financial institutions. So how do you think about what's the balance sheet, where's the distribution, who's going to own the product, where's the consumer? That's quite important to think about this. There's a concept of the digital native consumer, which is passé already, is really the digitally fluent consumer. Regardless of age, creed, culture, background, education, almost everyone is using financial services in a very different way, right? And they're really taking on the digital side of it. So it doesn't matter if they're 80-year-old or they're 20-year-old. So this concept that this is only something that the young ones do, completely erroneous, right? And then really finally the piece of this which is important is about economics. The tech part we take for granted. Who cares? It's the entry stake. It's about the fin part. And if a business is not scalable, it's not, need not apply, right? So what is the economics? Some of these models, as they look at social data, technology, and putting those models together, the cost points of these businesses now are 10x lower than what was a traditional financial institution doing, right? And that's what we're trying to figure out. So when we think about the thesis out there, there's a additional point of convergence going on in Africa, which is not really something that's as prevalent in the rest of the world. Rest of the world meaning the Western world and North America, for example. Convergence between financial services, insurance, health, even clean tech. So we're seeing a lot of convergence of models emerging where the consumer is asking for a very different kind of product set than we've traditionally provided. And so the idea is to find disruptive businesses which we can scale. Those are the important things, right? So this is about how we kind of put the ecosystem together to make it work. That's where we think about this.
Great. Thank you. Can I ask that we put the voting back up on the first, if you don't mind? So if I remember correctly, there was, we all agreed that super platforms, not all, but most of us did agree that super platforms will be the most powerful force. We still need to debate a little bit about which super platforms. But Professor Bey, let me ask you, we know Jack Ma was here in July. I think he visited Kenya, not here, but he did visit Kenya and Rwanda. Do you really think that some of these larger Chinese companies do have their sights set here on African markets? And if they do, how might they start to enter these markets?
Yeah, it's true. More and more Chinese people are getting to understand and know more about Africa. And some people come to China and persuade the Chinese company to go into Africa, like CEO of World Bank just a couple months ago. And he visited Ant Financial and asked them to go to Africa. And the World Bank will fully support your business in Africa. That means Africa is a huge potential market. However, based on my observation, all those super platforms, they start their business in Asia or Europe or even United States. Africa may be the last one. Why? Since, well, the distance may be one issue, but most of Chinese people are not so familiar with the African market. But however, everybody knows that this is a potential market. So they have a so-called international strategy, right? Want to expand their business. But the other thing I would say, if the Chinese company come to African country, they will think about how to localize their business. Just like we have experience in China 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we attract all those multinationals come to China. And then, after 40 or 30 years, we find out all successful companies are local companies and or JV, joint ventures. Not too many, multinational companies success in China. So all those people, these Chinese people know this history. They have kind of experience. They know how to access to the African country.
But why wouldn't Jack Ma just come in and buy out Jumia, which is already local?
Yeah, so I think most likely they will do some investment with a local counterparty to do some, the share investment. That's the best way. The other way is to establish a joint venture with the local partners.
Great, thank you. Chris, I have to ask you this because you used to be with the GSMA. Do you think MNOs are ripe for acquisition by these super platforms? Now, Ant Financial did buy out Mint, which is the parent company for Gcash, which, as many of you know, was one of the first mobile money companies in the world. Is this a good entry strategy? And we also know Airtel is divesting in most of their markets. I think they're in about 15 markets. They already have the logistics networks. They have the financial license. Isn't that a great entry point into Africa, which is obviously much broader with quite diverse markets?
I think they'd be more likely to partner, and they're certainly trying to partner rather than acquire. You take on board an incredible amount of capex and regulatory pain in buying a mobile operator. And I think probably what's more likely is they will try and push the mobile operators down to a position where they are just bit pipes, offering the cheapest possible internet to people so that they can then make their money through advertising or financial services. And there's certain things that Facebook is doing in particular that shows how this strategy is playing out for them. So Facebook has a project called the Telecoms Infra Project, TIP. And what TIP is doing is turning an entire part of the hardware stack of being a mobile operator, a lot of your customer management and network management hardware, and turning it into open source software as a way of basically taking an entire level of business value and capex out for mobile operators in the hope that it just crushes down the role of mobile operators to being relatively cheap, dumb internet pipes. And that feels like more of a sensible strategy for the Silicon Valley companies. Acquisition of Jumia, I think, is an interesting discussion to have as well, because effectively when you look at the potential entry strategies for the super platforms, it's acquire, provide the rails, or compete. So when you look at where WhatsApp revenue streams go, do they become a marketing and payments channel that allows Jumia to grow? And do those super platforms become a platform that you can build a local business on? Do they acquire the local business? You've got to remember Jumia's parent company is AIG, that used to be called Rocket Internet. And in the first .com phase in Europe, I remember Rocket Internet's strategy was very simple. They built clones in Europe of American e-commerce businesses and waited to get bought. So they built a Amazon clone and they built an eBay clone and sat there and waited for it to be acquired. Are they expecting that a similar thing will happen in Africa, and actually a big Silicon Valley firm will come in and buy Jumia? Or will they go directly and just compete? And I kind of think the latter strategy is probably more likely, because what's happened since the first phase of dot-com growth and acquisitions is the big super platforms have kind of calcified. You know, they find it really hard to kind of move out of one global business model and position. And it makes it very hard for them to acquire or manage businesses that are structurally different from their core position. We saw this with Uber in China and its partnership with Didi, that for various reasons didn't work and they backed out. But it feels to me like they would rather kind of try and impose their existing business model, however forcibly, on those markets and try and make them work the way they understand at a global level, rather than get into the nitty-gritty of trying to run a more local business on its own terms.
Great. So Nadeem, I know you agree with I'm not sure how many, 20% that don't think super platforms will be the most powerful force. So you must tell us why. Let's hear the voice of the minority.
Yeah, so those people with me, 20%. Look, I think this is a hypothesis, right? So it's not saying that super platforms are not important and they're not an impact. I look at it from a financial services lens point of view, and so my answer, my kind of interjection is from there. If you are running a Google or Amazon and Facebook and your economics are what they are, and you run high margin businesses with highly leveraged businesses, why would you want to ever get into a low margin business called financial services? It's not, it just doesn't make sense. And so when people talk about this fear factor and saying somehow they will come in, okay, how that is possible. Secondly, there's something called regulation, right? If Google starts using its data to suddenly sell insurance, then Google cannot use all its data for its advertising business, right? And suddenly there's restrictions. That's what financial institutions have, restrictions everywhere. So if suddenly Google starts doing that, that impacts like 90% of the revenue. Thirdly, it's about talent, all right? And so it's like saying Citibank is going to become Apple, or Apple is going to become Citibank. It's the same absurd statement, right, in my mind. It's like they have no understanding of financial services, products, compliance, regulatory environments. Consumers from that perspective is very different. And also financial services has always been a local thing, right? Otherwise, why not Citibank or JP Morgan's or First Rand or EcoBank? Why have not they dominated the world as we know? Because they were giants in financial services. Why are there thousands of banks, thousands of insurance companies in Ghana? Look at how many banks and insurance companies and stuff as a small country, right? So I think this is a little bit where we have to understand that financial services is very, very different than general e-commerce platforms. Very different story. I think there is a really deep understanding you need to have about the consumer, and the consumer is local, and consumer is convergent. So there's the first time the consumer is leading the charge ever in any technology revolution to date is the first time the consumer is leading the charge. So I think that's a pretty important factor. I think the organizational model that I alluded to, the unbundling of the organization model, it represents a completely new opportunity set for us, right? In thinking about it, so that's kind of shaping. So who has the balance sheet? Who has the manufacturing? Who has the products? Where's the customer? Who owns the customer? Those are all the things up for grabs, which also gives us a lot of impetus and kind of new models emerging. There is also this new ecosystem, right? The ecosystem, which is almost a new world order being created. The ecosystem is local, it's global, it's startups, it's financial institutions, it's regulators, it's academia. They're all playing in to create a very, very different kind of product proposition that we have not seen before. So I think those are the kind of things where I think financial services is a complicated business, and just someone coming into it and kind of in mass and in 20 years' time, or less than 20 years' time, 13 years' time, is going to take over, not possible. My view. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to hear from others in the room that voted no. So can I ask maybe somebody who doesn't agree that super platforms will be the most powerful force to just give us a little bit more insight as to why? Or you've all changed your minds since you voted, that's fine too. Okay, Antonique in the back.
Well, I must start by saying, Olga, you're pretty convincing, so you at least gained that. You know, I don't disagree necessarily that they will play an important role. So I thought the choices, the three choices, were actually rather difficult. But my question really is about the customers. And I actually, so while I'm making my plea, I also want to ask a question to the panel. I'm actually really wondering what the end benefit of customers overall is. And you made a compelling point about the data, and these super platforms will have it all, and so they can tailor and customize, great. But I'm wondering at what cost? And I'm kind of suspecting, as our last speaker said, that there might be some obstacles along the way for these companies, because it's the question that comes to my mind is, what are we actually doing with the monopolistic nature of some of these super platforms? Some of the research shows that these companies are amongst the companies that have the highest profit margins, and compared to more traditional companies, their margins are way, way higher. So with that, combined with the monopolistic nature, I'm just wondering what's in it for the customer at the end? At what cost are these super platforms overtaking the world? And I imagine that some parts of our democracy and economies and maybe regulation will kind of put a stop to that somewhere. Whether it's to protect customers or whether it's actually stopping disruption and be bad for customers after all, I don't know, but that's where I have my questions.
I'll have a stab at answering that, or at least agreeing violently with it. We have huge concerns in our research around platform power, and we are looking at companies that are globally monopolistic. We are looking at companies that don't pay taxes. I was very pleased that in the first year of Caribou Digital, I paid more tax than Facebook did in the UK.
Gosh.
As a company. And very often have next to no ground operations. So they're not creating jobs, they're not paying taxes, but they are making a huge amount of money. They look more like digital extractive industries than necessarily platforms. So it's, and this is an increasing challenge for regulators that we're seeing in the news every single day, not just around taxation, but obviously around media bias and politics and democracy. So we talk about what potentially could halt the kind of global expansion of the super platforms. Ultimately, it might be regulators. You know, a regulator is kind of like the end-level boss of your kind of global expansion plans, and it's a very hard boss to fight. We saw Microsoft get distracted massively by a battle with regulators. We're seeing Google distracted and increasingly distracted, and we're seeing it starting to happen with Facebook. So regulation does end up being something that, unless you are, as Nadeem says, in a area where you're constantly regulated, like mobile telecoms or finance, if it's not part and parcel of your business, you suddenly have it imposed upon you, it can utterly put the brakes under where you're going and what your growth is.
If I could comment, I think the power is going to go to consumer. If you play it out 10, 15 years, I think that what we describe as a power sitting with the platforms is going to go back there, because the technology and the access of the technology, blockchain as an example of it, is going to allow the consumers to control the data and be able to release the data, how they choose to release the data, to which provider of service they choose to release the data. You're already seeing in Europe, with the Data Act coming through and kind of bank having to disclose the data they have so the consumer can decide, that's already happening. And so if you play it out, the power will be there, and that's why the disruption, I think, will happen with the middle folks, like the Googles of the world that are at the moment kind of using advertising to kind of allow the products to be connected to consumer. I think the power is going to shift to the consumer, and they could decide who they want to be connected to. That's my view.
I really disagree with you there. I think I recently read, if somebody is giving you something for free, then you're the product, you're not the customer. And they're feeding all of us to their true customer, who's the advertiser. And I think the incentives are all set up in these platforms where you give them more and more and more, and you have less and less control, and the network effects where everybody else is also on the platform, and so are all of your suppliers and all your banks, which we're encouraging and hoping for. The whole ecosystem, you're on it or you're off it, and even if you're off it, if all of you are on it, then everything about me is known to everyone anyway. So I think we've already completely lost control of our data, and one of the challenges will be, that was mentioned in question 3 here, is what is financial inclusion what are we going to become? I think this is one of the core issues, is whatever the industry becomes, the platforms become, it has to deliver value for customers, and sometimes it's not inherent in the system that that's what it's going to do, and maybe that's going to be a challenge for all of us in the future.
Absolutely, but I think the demographics are already pointing differently, right? Already Facebook, in the ethnographic survey around this stuff, a lot of the teenagers, 17 down, are no longer on Facebook. It's already, they describe Facebook as the old person's tool. They are already working to different platforms. So the idea that we have that these platforms are where the power is, people are saying, no, actually I want to have private lives. I want to shut down everything. I want to go into more secure environments where we can share stuff. So I think that trend is already there because people are tired of the excess of some of these platforms that we're doing right now.
But even though they're on different platforms, those platforms are still mimicking Facebook's relationship with personal data. So they might be willfully not reading the T's and C's of yet another platform and ticking their personal data away. But the business model is still the same. We will take your attention and we will monetize it. And you're not going to be that cognizant of the way that process is. And I think somewhere between the two of you is potentially the answer, which is, I would love it to happen, but I think we're never going to see a moment when consumers awake to the power of their personal data fully and really take back control. And blockchain and distributed networks can enable that, but I think people don't care as much as we would like them to about their own data privacy. I can see nations doing it for good and bad, and I can see data sovereignty becoming an issue and looking at your nation's population's data as a national asset and making sure that you do get taxes and revenue from it from those people that extract it.
So we'll have super platform passports in the future, is what you're saying. Great. Can we move on to the second question, please? Because I think this is really relevant to a lot of the people in the room. So just to remind you, providers of financial services are at a high risk of becoming redundant. So this is a little bit more split. But Nadeem, I'm going to turn it to you because you have an advisory arm, as I was saying before, that basically advises banks how they should navigate this new world. What advice do you give the banks to really stay relevant here?
Yeah, look, I think, so what we start from is like the financial services future has never been brighter, right? So there is a real opportunity set available to the financial institutions that avail of it, right? And not everyone will. The reality of financial services is not that people will just die tomorrow and suddenly EcoBank disappears. I'm just picking out EcoBank, I don't know why. But it's that if they don't get it, they'll rust away. They'll decay over time, right? And so what we're trying to teach them is this is a completely different culture, right, about how to build businesses, a completely different mindset. It's a new set of toolkits that you have to think about available to you. And then you have to also get used to the idea that what you have been brought up thinking that you're good at, you're not good at. You're not good at product, right? You are not good at product. Every current account, checking account, mortgage, credit card looks exactly the same, right? There's no differentiation, so you cannot be good at product, right? So where I think the opportunity is in two sets of opportunity. One is there's lots of folks who are at the front end engaging with the consumer, and you provide your balance sheet and your trust and brand in the background and kind of the rails, the regulatory rails, and say, okay, you have the consumer, but we'll support you. Also the other way around, where you have a brand, you have a balance sheet, you have a trust, you have a distribution, you have customers, which a lot of startups don't, by the way, and how do you then take those products and seamlessly provide it through your networks, right? And your distribution, whatever that is. Yeah? And that's the opportunity. And so we have examples of folks doing both, where they are kind of taking advantage of the fact that they have the rails and the regulatory rails and the kind of the compliance rails and stuff in the background, but also flipping the other way around where they can really make money. So that's the opportunity set. But you have to get comfortable whether you are good at certain things and you're bad at certain things. What you're good at, you have a balance sheet, you're good at compliance, you're understanding of risk, you're understanding of consumer, you have built this over hundreds of years, right? And so it's how do you match that? So but it is you cannot, get to a light bulb by lighting 1,000 candles, right? So what we say to them is, look, this is not, you cannot keep doing the same thing better as they realize you'll get to a light bulb. You have to rethink the business model from the ground up. That doesn't mean that every person in the room is redundant, actually quite to the contrary. What we're seeing now In the evolution of financial services, fintech, you know, we had early stage, 2010, 2014, up to that point, a lot of young entrepreneurs coming in and disrupting businesses. No longer the case. Now we are in the heart of financial services, in the heart of the middle office, the back office, capital markets, insurance plays. These are senior executives coming in with lots of expertise, working with a new business model, working with a new toolkit to create this new paradigm, right? And that's the opportunity set. And so that's what I tell the banks. I think there's a, it's not a sprint. It's a 10, 15, 20-year play. But if you don't start thinking about it now, it's, you know, you'll decay.
Great. Well, Professor Bay, are banks becoming redundant in China? Or how are we seeing really their roles shift within the context of this broader digitization?
Yeah, this is a good issue that people discuss in China as well. However, I'm not so pessimistic for the future of banking system. Number one, all those banks actually spend a lot of money on technology. So like ICBC, they claim they are the #1 e-commerce platform, okay? So because they have 100 million, you know, customers, customer base is huge. So they increase their technology level to adapt to the market demands. Number two, which is very important, as we mentioned, the super platform, e-commerce, all those fintech company, actually their business, particularly for the financial business, are based on banking system. Okay, like Alipay, you need to have a bank account at first, and then you can do Alipay, right? And even for those, you know, online, like a P2P company or online trading company, they need to have banking system support, you know, where they get these lending funds to their customer. The bank provide the lending funds for this fintech company. So this is I would consider this is also an ecosystem, right? Bank support all those fintech companies. So finally, they find out, this fintech company find out if they have no offline on-site business or relationship with their clients, actually they cannot do, you know, as they expected. Particularly in rural areas, it's still very difficult for these e-commerce-based companies like Alibaba, Jack Ma is ambitious to do to copy the e-commerce from the urban area to rural areas. It's called the 1,000 Village Plan something, and he wants to spend 10 billion Chinese yuan to invest this Cuntao, you know, network to do the same thing in the B2C e-trading. But however, so far it's about 2 or 3 years past. Looks not so successful. Why? It's a rural area. You need to establish a new distribution system, logistics, and you will find out it's very difficult to maintain an aging system. Okay, management costs increase sharply. So finally, they decide they need to do some cooperation with the banking system. So now, all those big, you know, BATJ in China, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and JD, they all married with one big bank, like ICBC, CCB, ABC, you know. So this is kind of, I will look at it's a kind of trend. The bank will cooperate with these new disruptors.
Great, so 2 good votes for banks, but I'm going to ask the crowd if anyone thinks banks will become redundant.
One thing that's interesting in this debate, I feel, is that it's very much focused on the providers. Will we be redundant? And what's going through my mind is, why do we care? Do we care because we fear that we're going to become redundant, or do we care because we think that clients are going to be served, not going to be served as well by these other players? So I'd love to hear from the panel, if, let's assume that we are right and that those are coming and are going to play a big role in offering financial services, then, is that automatically a bad thing? And if it is, if there are some clearly negative aspects for the clients, and maybe to build off of what Antonique was saying, then is there something that we can do as an industry to counter that? And what should that be? What should we be doing and maybe partnering with them to continue to be client-centric?
I think that's the core question that's facing all of us. If we think, and we do think, that there'll be at least some disruption from these platforms, and right now it seems they're possibly good at payments. We don't know yet what that impact, the bigger impact on the whole ecosystem of payments is going to be. But the question for those of us in financial inclusion, we did not get into this so that people can have an account, as has been mentioned earlier today. We got into it because we think finance drives many different, or at least enables many different things in the economy and in our own personal and household life. And that's what all of you, the financial institutions, have grown up to deliver and provide. And if the platforms drive people out of financial intermediation as an activity in the economy, I think it'll be harmful both for the individual and for society at a broader level. So the challenge is to remain relevant, and the challenge for us as financial inclusion is to make sure that those aspects that are life improving are enriched and reinforced and delivered, and if the delivery mechanism is through those platforms, that it's available through that. So I think there's a big risk that we kind of go completely off the rails and engage in a much shallower level of financial activity, which is potentially broader, but that does not deliver on the thing that we've all been promising as a financial inclusion industry, and the important role that banks play in our economy could potentially be reduced, and that would only be harmful.
The phrase we're using in the Partnership for Finance in a Digital Africa with Mastercard Foundation and the many learning partners who are in the room is not financial inclusion, but meaningful financial inclusion, which stems from Jonathan Donner, our senior researcher who's in the room as well, his book After Access by MIT Press that talks about meaningful use of the internet. There is not digital inclusion. You don't have the internet or don't have the internet. There's a whole world of gradations between those around how much the internet actually empowers you, gives you agency, and gives you the ability to participate in the digital economy or not. So meaningful inclusion, meaningful use becomes a really critical term when we look at whether these super platforms are actually empowering consumers or not. I mean, Facebook is a client-centric company. Facebook is a relentlessly client-centric company to the point where actually its focus on the needs of the user supersede the needs of broader society. It will very happily feed you a newsfeed that only shows you what you want to see and not care if the democracy and the fourth estate around it collapses. So I don't think client centricity is an issue when you look at the super platforms, but I think understanding the agency and power that individuals within those platforms have and defining what meaningful use means, whether it's financial inclusion, digital inclusion, or whatever kind of inclusion we're looking at in the digital space, becomes the thing we're really wanting to look at and wanting to define.
I think when I walk around the startup space and in boardrooms with folks and executives, this terminology, customer focus, client centricity never comes up. Never ever comes up. I never hear the term. I only hear the term in big organizations and financial institutions, right? It's like, really? What were you doing before if you're now customer focused? The other piece of this is, I think the definition of financial inclusion, and Olga is probably never going to invite me back now, it's passé already. It's based on the old economic model, right? Which was basically a bank to provide a retail account to someone. It means a cost base of $200 in the US, $200 to $400 is what it takes in the US. And you can apply the same number in any country, in Europe and so on, it's 200 euros, that sort of thing. Now some of these new entrants are doing it for 10 euros. That's their cost base. So Moniz, who was a startup operating for the underbanked, unbanked in the UK, has 3 million customers that they see as very profitable customers. And they're saying, great, all the banks can compete for all those profitable ones they think are profitable. We'll go after these unbanked who are completely profitable customers. This is not a charitable thing. This is not a financial inclusion thing. This is because we can provide them a service which they need in the way they need it, in a very custom method, which is completely going to change the model. Jumo out of South Africa and operating in East Africa, West Africa, is providing SME lending to what were considered unbanked, underbanked. You know, banks been trying for it for a long time, trying to put all the infrastructure in place. You know, and some of the most successful ones had 100,000 customers after 6 years of trying. Jumo has 6 million customers after a year, right? So that definition that we are grappling with is based on the old models that we have grown up with. And I think the business model available to us now to address the issue is completely different. And I think that's what we need to think about.
So on that note, actually, if we just can put up the third question, I was struck by the fact that there was a majority or voting that we need to kind of rethink how we're defining. And just to confirm, I have 1 minute left. 35 seconds. I'm giving myself a minute, Roger. Give me 30 seconds. So let me finish on this question. If it's no longer access, usage, and stimulating usage, I mean, if this is no longer the problem we're trying to solve in financial inclusion, then what should we be trying to solve for in the context of this new world?
I think I'll pick up on Chris's word meaningful. And we've had some of those discussions in the prior groups, but when we look at why are we interested in the customer? It's so that we can get them something meaningful in terms of improvements in their lives. And I think that challenge is not smaller. If anything, it's greater with the super platforms coming on, and the fact that we have to throw away some good number of the things we already know because the world is different. I think that challenge is at least as large and possibly growing. And we as a community, the providers, the supporters, the donors, that really focusing in on the word meaningful is going to be where we need to go.
Is it meaningful financial inclusion or meaningful inclusion?
I think that finance permeates everything, but our tool is financial, and that's the tool we've chosen. We could be in some other world, but I think financial inclusion retains its importance, but making it meaningful is what the challenge is going to be, because some of those access parameters, which we've all been working so hard on for so many years, are rapidly disappearing.
There's an African financial super platform we haven't mentioned on this panel. And in the same way that you asked how many people have used Jumia, I'm tempted to say how many people have used SportPesa. And I won't ask people to put their hands up because they're probably using SportPesa while we're in the room. But on our app, when we look at what people are doing on their phones, about 30% of non-airtime top-up transactions on M-Pesa are gambling, and when you look at sub $2, it goes up even more. So Dave Kim, who's in the room, sponsored some really good research by Mozilla Foundation, the Digital Skills Observatory in Kenya, that really took this head on and said, actually, when we look at the broad array of different products that people use in the digital space, of which gambling is one, how can we turn those into things that drive meaningful financial usage, and how can you sounds bizarre, but it's an interesting idea. Create gambling products that allow people to save and put some of their winnings and losses back into accounts and things. So I think, as well as focusing on meaningful, we have to have this really broad sense of what a financial product is, which comes back to your original thesis. That, this is not those absolutely boring same-o banking products. That actually financial products in the digital world are a broad range of things, from e-commerce and P2P payments over here to gambling over here. And people's experience of them will absolutely sit across that continuum.
Right.
I can comment on it. It's like we're doing work with Momentum Group out of South Africa around financial wellness. And that's a term I think that's maybe more relevant, right? Because financial inclusion always meant more of a banking, payments kind of infrastructure. What we're finding now, and that's a conversion of the consumer going on, is there's a need for physical, digital, and emotional wellness, which is all tied in finance services. And so that definition is very, very important. And so a lot of the products that we're putting out there and thinking about creating handle those three dimensions. the dimension of financial inclusion, just giving access to someone to a bank account is not enough if they don't know how to handle the pressures of debt and credit and all that kind of stuff, right? So that is now, it used to be separate conversations, it used to be because we were not able to answer them in a cohesive way. Now the models are there to answer that in a very holistic way, and that's already here. It's already happening. We have business after business we're investing in. We're just 9 businesses that are the financial wellness focused fund we have, and it's happening globally. So I think that's where, as a practitioners in this space that are thinking about the space, I think we need to really look at that and kind of think about a very different paradigm than we used to.
So unfortunately, we do have to end. I'll just say one more thing before we go, and that's there is a paper coming out that was co-authored between Bankable Frontiers Associates, David Porteous and myself, probably in the next month or so, should this panel whet your appetite to learn a little bit more about this topic. And I do want to thank our panelists for a great discussion, and also the audience for being involved as well. And I think that's it. So thank you, everyone.